This week we're looking at perhaps the biggest if in the Bible. It's in Galatians chapter 2, verse 21, and let's start out by reading that verse from the ESV. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for nothing. So we're going to look at the verse in three parts. Let's dive right in. Uk atheto tein karin tu theou. Uk atheto. I do not nullify. Uk is negating, and atheto is I nullify, declare invalid, or set aside. It's like a conscious decision to dismiss something. And because it's in the present tense, he says, I am not, or I do not continually nullify, dismiss, set aside, declare invalid. What? Tein karin, the grace tu theou of God. Let's go on to the second part. Agar, for if, dianamu dikaiosune. So for if, we're getting a condition here. We have an if in this part of the verse, and then in the third part we're going to get the then, if, then. And when we get to the third part, we'll decide whether or not this is a first-class condition assumed to be true for the sake of argument, or a second-class condition assumed to be false for the sake of argument. So what does he say? He says, for if dianamu, through law or by means of law, dikaiosune, righteousness. So for if righteousness is or was through the law or by means of law. So the question is righteousness a right standing before God, sort of a forensic innocence before God? Is that accomplished by means of keeping the law? The only way that that can be possible is to do so perfectly from birth. You have to have a zero sin record from birth to be righteous in the eyes of God through the keeping of the law. Why? Because nothing that I do today, no matter how perfectly I conduct myself today, it can't change what I did yesterday or any day prior to today. So let's give a practical example. If I make a decision to not steal an apple on Tuesday, it in no way, shape, or form unsteals the apple that I stole on Monday. Okay? So did I keep the law, thou shalt not steal, on Tuesday? Yes, I did. But that's what I was supposed to do anyway. That's the baseline. So by not stealing on Tuesday, I have done nothing to affect the stealing that I did on Monday. We can find ourselves kind of falling into what I like to call the spreadsheet fallacy. We start looking at a spreadsheet and say, boy, in my life I did some bad things. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to not do bad things to balance out the spreadsheet. But no matter how many not bad things I stack up in the good column, it doesn't alter the things that are in the bad column. It's not credits and debits. Even if I say I'm going to go above not doing bad, I'm going to proactively do good and therefore offset the bad things, it still doesn't do that. So on Tuesday, if I not only don't steal an apple, but I go give an apple that I already have to some hungry child, that's a good thing to do. It still doesn't unsteal the apple that I stole on Monday. So set aside the spreadsheet fallacy, set aside the ledger of credits and debits and trying to do enough good to offset the bad, because nothing that I do today changes the facts of what I did yesterday or some prior day. Let us go on to the then that's attached to our if in part 3. Ara Christos dorean apethanen. So ara, then, there's the then for our condition. Christos, Christ, apethanen, in the aorist tense, simple past, died. Then Christ died. Dorean is an adverb describing the the nature of the action of dying for nothing, in vain, with no purpose, in an empty fashion. So if righteousness is by the keeping of the law, or through the means of the keeping of the law, then Christ died. The historic reality of his death on the cross is for nothing. It's in vain. It's without purpose. So let's talk about our condition. Do we think that Paul thinks that Christ died for nothing? No. Therefore, do we think that Paul's argument in the if phase is arguing the truth or a falsehood, that righteousness is attained by the keeping of the law? He clearly doesn't think that. So this is a second-class condition, presumed to be false for the sake of argument. So Paul is saying, when he says, if righteousness is by the keeping of the law, what he really means is righteousness is not attained by the keeping of the law. That's not how righteousness happens. In fact, he says elsewhere and often, the only way for righteousness to be attained is for the righteousness of Christ to be imputed to the sinful life of the believer. So what he's saying here is if you let yourself think that you can be righteous through law keeping, then what you're saying about the historic reality of the death of Christ on the cross on your behalf is that it was for nothing. Why? Because you're not seeking to be righteous by means of his righteousness. You're seeking to prove your righteousness through law keeping. And back to the first clause, thereby nullifying the grace of God. When God gives you grace, unmerited favor, and offers you righteousness that you can't attain to cure the sin problem that you have from yesterday, today, and every day of your life through the imputed righteousness of Christ, you nullify that grace by saying, I don't want the sacrifice on the cross for me. I'm going to do it on my own 2 feet. I'm going to do so much non-apple stealing that the apples I stole in the past won't mean anything. But here's the dirty, dark secret. Put the spreadsheet down. None of the non-apple stealing of today offsets the apples that were stolen on previous days. You can't undo what has been done. So, if you try to law keep your way to righteousness, if you say, I'm going to do it myself, you're setting aside the grace of God, saying, I don't need that. And as a result, the death of Christ on the cross is with no purpose. It becomes empty and meaningless because it's not, you believe that you don't need it, don't want it, you're going to do it yourself. If you can or could be righteous by means of keeping the law starting today, like I'm going to do good now, then that's what everyone should be doing. And not only that, the reality is, according to Paul and all the other biblical writers, you can't. You just can't. So if you find yourself reaching for the spreadsheet and looking at credits and debits to try and show that I've not stolen enough apples for enough days in a row that now maybe I'm worthy of standing before God's throne and being judged as a righteous person, you are deceiving yourself, and the truth is not in you, according to John in 1 John. I think it's chapter 1, verse 9. Have a look at your leisure. It might be verse 8. Have a look at your leisure. That's the challenge. The challenge of that big if is recognizing that, in fact, righteousness is not by the keeping of the law, because if it was, then that would mean that Christ died for nothing, and that's an abhorrent notion in the eyes of the Apostle Paul and most anyone who's read through the entirety of the New Testament. And if Christ died for nothing and you could be righteous by keeping the law, then your self-proclaimed righteousness nullifies the grace of God. The grace of God is meaningless because the death of Christ on the cross is meaningless because I don't need that. I do it myself by means of not stealing apples on Tuesday. Thanks for watching. Hope that was good for you. If it was, please like, share, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And until next time, Charis Kairini, Humene, grace and peace to you.